Good evening, Moon Princess here, and tonight we're going to talk about a true crime case, and this case has sexually explicit content. There's violence, there's murder, so if those are topics that you don't want to hear about, I'm warning you now, just watch another video. So with that, if you're still interested, let's get into the case. Alright, so tonight we're going to talk about the Girl Scout murders from 1977. Triple homicide. So this occurred at Camp Scott in Oklahoma. 3 Girl Scouts were abducted, raped, and murdered. Their names were Lori Farmer, Michelle Gousset, Denise Milner, and they were all raped and murdered in 1977. This is a Girl Scouts camping trip. The camp was just outside of the Cherokee Reservation near Tulsa, Oklahoma. So they had just met on their first day. All 3 girls were staying in the same tent. They met on June 12th. In fact, Denise Milner initially didn't even want to come because one of her friends had stayed home and canceled. But her mom convinced her to go and make new friends. The camp was supposed to last for 2 weeks and allow the girls to learn new skills and have adventures. Unfortunately, early into the camp, it began to rain and a thunderstorm occurred. The girls had to spend a lot of their time on the first day inside their tents or cabins. And they also wrote letters, and somewhere Lori had written, "I've met 2 new friends. I'm sharing a tent with them. We're sleeping on cots. I couldn't wait to write. Love, Lori." And she wrote that to her, I think her mom. Also wanted to make a side note here for you. So I don't know if you guys know who Kristin Chenoweth is. I don't really. I'll find a picture and put it in the video though. But at the time when this happened, she was 8 years old and she lived close by to the camp. And she was supposed to go, but she got sick. And she had to stay home. Had that not happened, it's entirely possible she too could have had the same fate. So Kristin Chenoweth is a famous actress, apparently. She has contributed to a documentary from 2022 that is about the case. I did watch it, but it's actually really interesting, I thought. But yeah, some of the things she's in are Pushing Daisies, Wicked, RV, Descendants, Annie, Tinkerbell, and Rio. Also, in April 1977, 2 months prior to the murders, camp counselors had training sessions at Camp Scott, and the trip was actually cut short when one counselor found their cabin trashed and a threatening note resting on top of an empty donut container. The note said, "We are on a mission to kill 3 girls in tent 1. They also found a dummy hanging by a noose around its neck, and they chalked it up to pranks. Some kind of prank. So prior to the girls being murdered, items had been disappearing out of tents. Counselors had received some kind of threatening notes, and apparently people had said that they saw men lurking around the campgrounds. But again, they chalked this up to pranks. On the night of June 12th, all 3 girls were pulled from their tent. Lori, Michelle, and Denise were in tent number 8, which was further away and more isolated from the other tents, and at night you really couldn't see it. It was kind of blocked by the restroom. There was actually supposed to be a 4th member of their tent, but she wasn't supposed to arrive till the next day. So she didn't end up being a victim. At around 7 p.m., they went back to their tent, rushing in from the thunderstorm. So tent number 8 is known as Camp Kiowa. It was further away and at night hard for counselors to see and keep an eye on the campers in that tent. So Counselor Carla woke first at roughly midnight. She heard campers giggling by the bathroom, and she marched over there and she was like, "Y'all better stop that." And she marched them back to their tents. Not long after, the girls in tent 6 started laughing, and Carla and another counselor stopped by and told them to be quiet. Then, a while later, several campers and counselors heard moaning sounds from the direction of cabin 8. Camp counselor Carla had looked around but could not figure out the source of the sound. She just chalked it up to animal noises and returned to her tent. This occurred around 1:30 a.m. The noise was said to have stopped for a moment, and then Carla headed back to her tent before the sound resumed again. She flashed her light and it stopped, then started again. And the noises also seemed to be getting louder. At 2 a.m., a scout from Tent 7 woke up to a flashlight at the entrance of their tent. Then at 3 a.m., scouts heard screams coming from the direction of Tent 8. They heard another scream and someone saying, "Mama, Mama." Scared and panicked, the scouts went to bed, so they didn't alert anybody. The next morning at 6 a.m., Carla, camp counselor Carla Willite, woke early to shower before rousing the girls. She finished her shower and headed towards Kawapa Camp and the staff house. This was when she found one of the girls from cabin number 8, jammed inside their sleeping bags nearby the main road leading into the camp, noticing them near the fork of the trail. Initially, she didn't realize they were human bodies. She approached them, finding 2 in their sleeping bags, and Denise was found laying face up and naked from the waist down. Carla rushed to grab the other camp counselors, Dee and Susan. Dee makes it to Tent 8 at some point, and this is when they realize the 3 are missing from their tent. Carla speaks with the camp director about the situation, and a nurse goes to look at the body. After the bodies were found, Highway Patrol was called. Then Sheriff Weaver arrives and requests assistance from OSBI, Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation. And by 10 a.m., they had the camp evacuated, according to sources. So Lori Farmer and Michelle Gousset had been bludgeoned to death, while Denise Milner was strangled to death. Denise was found with her hands restrained behind her back, head injuries sustained. All 3 had been brutally beaten and raped prior to their deaths. From what I read, it is believed that the 2 girls were killed in the tent, so I'm guessing Michelle and Lori, who were bludgeoned, and then Denise was brought to a different part of the woods. The 2 girls, Lori and Michelle, were found 150 yards away from their cabin. The cabin was covered in blood. But given the distance from the other tents, this made their cabin the ideal target for his victims, and that's why he chose this group of girls. Boot prints were found leading from Kiowa Camp to the dump locations. The killer came up to the tent from behind and unhooked the back flaps to enter. Blood splatter was found all over the canvas walls and wooden floor. Both Lori and Michelle were sexually assaulted from inside the tent. The killer tried to wipe up the blood with the bed sheets and unintentionally left behind a boot print of a size 9.5. No fingerprints discovered from what I read. So, Denise, on the other hand, had been bound, gagged with something pre-made, and forced to walk to where her body was later found. She also was sexually assaulted, bludgeoned, and then strangled to death. The crimes were clearly planned out with intent. Each victim had semen on their remains, and a red flashlight was found at the scene beside their bodies. Hair was found in some of the duct tape, which was believed to belong to the killer, as it did not match the victims. The victims were bludgeoned by more than one object, the killer using both his hands in the process and utilizing multiple knots to restrain his victims. So that's why I think that it's more than one person, but we've only got one person that we think did it at this point. So some believe this indicates multiple individuals involved in their deaths. I do, though only one has been found to this day. Weapons used were never found. It is likely the killer or killers took them when they departed. Fingerprint was found on the flashlight lens. Police brought out dogs, but they were unable to pick up a scent. Maybe this was due to the rain and thunderstorms of the previous day. I don't know, just my speculation. Police took a look around camp, and close by Tent 8, they discovered duct tape, rope, a flashlight, and someone's glasses. The flashlight had been stuffed with newspaper, as the batteries seemed to rattle, which would have drawn more attention to the perpetrator. The tape and rope found at the scene was a match for the kind used on the victims. A bit further from the tent, they found a crowbar and empty beer bottles. As they continued, more tape was found, groceries, photos, more newspapers, all in a nearby cave. The newspapers matched the issue of the pieces found in the flashlights. Along the cave wall, police read, "The killer was here. Bye-bye, fools. 77-6-17. They found photos in the cave. Who Louise Lindsay from Granite Reformatory told police. Jean Leroy Hart, that it had something to do with him. Some things I read said that he developed them or that he took her photos. But there was a connection between the photos and the prison because Jean was supposed to be in prison and he had escaped. So it was reported that Shroff Ranch, a mile from Camp Scott, reported rope, duct tape, and beer had been stolen from them. After the girls were murdered, Camp Scott was never opened again. Upon discovery of the victims' remains, Camp Scott was evacuated. Girl Scouts were not yet aware of what had just transpired. Camp Scott had been open from 1928, but following the tragic deaths, it was sold to a family in the area a few years later. So I think it was sold in like 1980, and the murders happened in 77. So we're going to talk about somebody, but there's no clear direct connection to this person. It's just like some mentions I saw online. So John Russell was suspicious of Carl Lee Myers. So John Russell is a convicted felon with a record of embezzlement and check fraud. And he sought to make a movie about the Girl Scout murders called Candles. According to Russell, while incarcerated in Ottawa County Jail in 1979, he shared that one of his fellow inmates, by the name of Carl Lee Myers, confessed to committing the murders. So it is possible he's the other person involved, but I didn't see anything that substantiated that. This is the only mention I have. So Myers was already a convicted murderer and died in prison back in 2012. He had been on death row for murdering Cindy Marzano in 1996. He was also linked to the rape and murder of Sean Williams, but police never were able to make a connection between him and the Girl Scout murders. November 11th, 2021, John Russell died. Sources say that his son is now trying to make the movie Candles happen. We'll see if that ever happens. However, aside from this one reference to Carl, he was not the main suspect or person of interest for this case. Police immediately suspected Jean Leroy Hart. He was supposed to be serving a life sentence in prison for previous crimes, but he had escaped. Jean Leroy Hart escaped from prison and hid on his mother's property, which was very close by Camp Scott. He was hiding there for almost 4 years. Also, stolen items from Scott campgrounds were found in the cave close by, and Hart was actually seen hiding out in the cave. Also wanted to point out, when it came to Jean's feet, his feet were size 11, and those are too big for the boot prints that were indicated from the scene. So that's another thing that makes me think that there's a second person. So this does support the theory of a second person involved. It makes me wonder if maybe Carl did help, but we may never know. I would also say that if a rapist or murderer is said to possibly be hiding out nearby, why would you be holding a Girl Scout camp close by the area he could be hiding? Like, if if his mother lives close to there, wouldn't somebody know? Like, I'm just curious what you guys think. Wouldn't he be in the news? Like in the news or something? Like, wouldn't people know this person is missing? And oh, his mom lives in this area. I don't know. But yeah, so his arrest, trial, and acquittal. Police searched for 10 months before finding him in a cabin located in Cherokee County. Gene was arrested in April 1978. Mr. Sam Pigeon, a medicine man, allowed him to stay with him as he said, "I don't think he done it." Upon his arrest, as Agent Larry Boyles went to cuff Gene, he said to Gene, "You killed those little girls, didn't you?" To which Hart replied, "You'll never pin it on me." I read somewhere that some claimed Gene was a shapeshifter who could turn into a dog. Many saying that they have spotted a black dog in the woods they presume to be him. I'm not saying I agree with that. I just thought that was interesting. Also because he's Cherokee. So Hart was strongly supported by people in the area. As he grew up in the area near Camp Scott, victims' families had to have police escorts to protect them from those who were defending Gene, according to some sources. So this was at 22. He ended up serving time for June 4th, 1966 rape and kidnapping convictions. He raped and kidnapped 2 pregnant women, Kathy and Carla, whom he abducted from a nightclub in Tulsa. He forced them into his car, drove them to the outskirts of Locust Grove. He brutally raped and sodomized them both, tying them up in the woods, taping their noses and mouths with duct tape, and he left them to die. But they didn't. They ended up getting free. The women called police the morning of June 5th, 1966. The women described him as incoherent during the rape, making strange growling noises, similar to the noises described on the night the Girl Scouts were murdered. He was sentenced to 30 years for their rapes and kidnapping charges. He ends up on parole, and it doesn't stop there. On the morning of June 7th, 1969, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, he broke into Heather Campbell's apartment. Campbell was a Tulsa police officer. The noise woke her up. She grabbed her pistol and told him to shut the door or I'll blow your head off, before she swiftly called her police department. He was arrested and sentenced to prison. So he had been convicted on burglary, rape, and kidnapping charges. He escaped jail in 1973, was recaptured, and escaped September 1973, hiding out near his mom's house. Informants assisted police in retrieving Hart, arresting him in a small house in the forest of Adair County, April 16th, 1978, which was located 45 miles from Camp Scott, and a year preceding the violent murders. All right, so evidence. They had his semen, a type which only 0.002% of the population have, so not able to test DNA evidence, as they have been able to now, but still significant for trial at the time. The semen sample, a stain found on Michelle's pillowcase located inside her sleeping bag, but also, as I mentioned before, on the bodies. It was also mentioned that they found hair on Denise Milner's body that looked similar to Gene's. Gene was tried for the Girl Scout murders, March 1979, but the jury found him not guilty. Many thought evidence was planted due to him being Native American. He was acquitted at some point for the Girl Scout murders, and 2 months after his acquittal passed, 2 months after his acquittal, he passed away. He had a heart attack, June 4th, 1979, 2 years following the Girl Scout murders. Some conspiracy theorists speculated that maybe he was poisoned with cyanide. I don't know. Gene Leroy Hart was affiliated with the Cherokee Nation and was respected in his community. All right, so Gene Hart, having grown up a high school athlete and a member of Anishinaabeg Nation, some believe that had he been tried outside of Mayes County, that he would really have had
a greater chance of being convicted, and that the jury was biased because it was where he grew up and everybody knew him, things like that. So DNA evidence was saved. The DNA from the crime scene was tested in 1989, and the results were inconclusive. So I wouldn't have been able to make a full match, only partial. So the DNA was tested again in 2008, but said to have been too degraded for the available DNA technology to really draw any conclusions. So Oklahoma authorities and the family of Girl Scout murder victims have, through the years, maintained that Hart is guilty of the murders. Mays County Sheriff Mike Reed actually began reinvestigating this case in 2013. And then in May of 2022, he announced the DNA testing linked Hart to the Girl Scout murders. So 46 years later, so eventually numerous experts were able to conclude that Jean Leroy Hart was the only person who could have done it, according to what I have read and the documentary that I watched. And in 2019, DNA evidence was retested, and DNA indicates Jean and eliminates other suspects and matches Jean Hart's DNA, but some information was saying that it was still not conclusive, that it's still inconclusive, like officially, but he's still not ruled out. And it makes them feel more certain that he did it, if that makes sense. Like, I guess it's not fully conclusive because it's not as good of a sample of DNA. It's interesting. So Reed said that the latest DNA testing resulted in several partial profiles of the killer. There we go. No full DNA profile was ever developed in the case. So officially, the test results can only be considered inconclusive. They can't be considered officially conclusive because they're partials. So they can be used to eliminate suspects, and authorities originally questioned over 130 potential suspects in the case, and others were questioned over the years, and DNA has again been collected from numerous people. And testing, they were able to eliminate some of these individuals through DNA testing, but never Hart's. So Lori's mother, Sherry Farmer, says that the DNA evidence gives us some peace, but certainly no closure. Victim Michelle Lucey's father, Richard, went on to develop the Victims' Bill of Rights in Oklahoma and the Oklahoma Victims' Compensation Board. So he shares feelings that police and prosecutors ignored him and his wife, which kind of inspired him to develop the bill. The bill allowed them to establish coordinating centers in Oklahoma to allow victims and their family to be involved in the legal process. The board helps victims and family members receive financial support and assistance with medical bills. Lori's mother, Sherry, went on to establish the Oklahoma chapter of Parents of Murdered Children to support the family of murder victims. So I thought that was a fitting way to end this video. I hope that you found this video interesting. I really did. So I actually was a Girl Scout, so maybe there's like this morbid curiosity in me that I'm particularly fascinated by things that almost feel familiar, in a way. I don't know. I thought this was cool. So like and subscribe if you found this video interesting, if you enjoyed hearing about the case, and I look forward to seeing the next one. Sweet dreams, Moonies. Good night.